Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah White. I'm Director of Operations at historic St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm here today to talk to National Park Service Park Ranger Nathan Hall. Nathan works both at the Richmond National Battlefield Park, at Chimborazo, and at the Maggie Walker National Historic Site. And today we're going to talk about the Van Loo House in Church Hill and the remarkable women who had ties to that house. First, I'm going to read a prologue from a book called Southern Lady Yankee Spy by Elizabeth Varon, just to set the stage for the house that we're talking about. The house that stood atop Gray Street in the elegant Church Hill neighborhood of Richmond still presented an imposing facade, with its stately pillars, wide porches, and sweeping view of the James River below. Yet this was a home that spoke of past glories. Its stucco was chipped and its paint was peeling. Its once magnificent gardens were now overgrown and unkempt. Carriages no longer came calling, and servants no longer bustled to and fro. Inside, the dust was thick on the carpets and windowsills. In the drawing room, beneath a large mirror, an elderly lady, dressed in black, looked down mournfully at the body of her aunt, a small, worn, nearly skeletal figure laid under a tightly pulled covering. This was the body of Elizabeth Van Loo, who died in the early morning hours of September 25th, 1900, at the age of 81.
Great place to begin, and a great setting that does kind of evoke an interesting imagery of this big, old Virginia style mansion. Takes up an entire block, has a terraced garden. It really it epitomizes that sort of antebellum Virginia of a person who, makes a lot of money, builds an estate, and it's an estate that is supported by enslaved labor. And John Van Loo, who moved into that house and gave it that renovations with his wife and then his daughter, Elizabeth, made his money in the hardware business. So essentially not in plantations and agriculture, but selling things like garden tools and plows and things like that. So just as much a part of that pre-Civil War growth of the slavery system in Virginia. And so that house can represent kind of Virginia as it was and how it made the transition. During the war, it becomes the actual epicenter of espionage and spying activity of Virginians and Richmonders who wanted the Union to stay back together. The fight is at that home. And when it's over, Virginia is never quite the same economically. So when you look to the future of what Virginia is going to be post-Civil War and into the 20th century, that house is right there on the precipice. When the 20th century comes, that house is close to it'll soon be demolished and gone. And there are three people that we can talk about that have origins in that house that also represent that transitional time. Elizabeth Van Loo is a woman born in the antebellum years in Virginia, grows up in that sort of system and grows up with all the contradictions that Virginians often have of seeing slavery and not liking it, but making the individual choice of to what extent are you going to do anything to undermine it or stop it before the war. And then the war becomes that precipice moment for everybody. And then her choice to actually become an agent to change it. The other person we'll talk about is Mary Jane Richards, who is a servant in that house. And we use the term servant as opposed to enslaved person as somebody who's paid to work there, and assists in the espionage and in the spying. And when the choice comes for her, leaves the city and goes elsewhere. And then finally, a child is born in that house in 1864. An African-American young girl who grows up to make history, Maggie Walker, as the first African-American woman to start a bank in this country. So you have a white woman who is representative of kind of the old South and the contradictions of Virginia, you have a young black woman during the war who represents what it's like to be an adult when slavery transitions to freedom and having to make your way in that uncertain world. And you have at that very same spot a child who comes into the world as the first generation of people who never experienced it, but their parents will be able to tell them about it, and they will, of course, they'll be living in Reconstruction and Jim Crow Richmond and Virginia.
Let's go back to Elizabeth Van Lew. So her father bought the house. He was a merchant, like you said. His wife, Eliza, Elizabeth's mother, and her father was an abolitionist and former mayor of Philadelphia and Revolutionary War patriot. So there was some different politics going on in that household. Maybe not different politics, but we had this stream of uncomfortableness with slavery. So let's suppose that we are living in Richmond and we are part of this society and we don't like slavery. You know, what would they do? What are some of the things that they could do? Because those are some of the things that they did.
Right. So you have, once Mr. Van Lew is passed, and he has, if you look at what his views on the system of slavery are, he has placed something in his will that says that his wife and his children cannot free the people in the household. What we can tell, Mrs. Van Lew and her daughter Elizabeth obviously didn't feel great about the institution of slavery. So you're looking at what are the options if you live in Richmond, Virginia in the 1840s and you don't like slavery on a personal level, what can you do about it? And the option is available. There is a manumission law. You can, if you choose, you can free the people that you nominally own. If you do, the law is going to require them to leave the state. So that's a conversation that would have to happen in that household. Where are you going to go? It's an additional sort of hurdle to that. So we know that's something that they chose not to do. And we have that one very unusual case. One person who is an enslaved person in the household, quote, Mary Jane by name, is baptized at St. John's Church. She's described in the baptism record as belonging to Mrs. Van Lew. But by the time she's a teenager, she has, I haven't seen a manumission record, but we can say that she is, because she has been sent away to New Jersey to go to school, which is against the law. And once you go there and stay for a certain amount of time, you are free. She is Mary Jane Richards, we know by name, by this point, has been sent to Liberia to be a missionary. So one person in that household, at least, seems to be enslaved and then actually given their freedom. You will see, I think, Dr. Varon in her book, Southern Lady Yankee Spy, tracked a few other things like real estate transactions that were free African Americans who were sold land at kind of below market value that seems to have been circumstantially things that they were doing to help. So in the spectrum of all the way from ignoring slavery, which is what many, many, many Virginians are doing, to this is the era when the positive good is being formulated. So increasing numbers of Virginians are arguing that slavery is actually beneficial and a good thing. On that spectrum, all the way to manumission and setting up people in free states, they are closer to the, the abolitionist side, but we can't say that they're kind of all the way there. So uncomfortable with the system. There's an ageless, timeless tradition in Virginia of people who don't like slavery and are trying to figure out something to do about it. She's more on the abolition end than many Virginians. A thing that's worth pointing out too is how extreme it's gotten. By the time the end of the 1850s rolls around, it is against the law in Virginia to own abolitionist literature, quote unquote. There's actually a law on the books that says if a white person is to say out loud that people don't have an inherent right to property in slaves, they can be arrested on sight by any white man. If you say slavery is bad and should go away on a street corner in Richmond in 1860, you can go to jail. If somebody mails you a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's illegal to receive in the mail in Richmond, and the postmaster is told they have to burn it and fine you. That's how bad it's gotten. So we
Wow.
shouldn't forget how extreme, even though Elizabeth Van Lew isn't a full tilt freeing everybody and sending them north, just being an abolitionist openly in Richmond, Virginia in 1860 is considered a very extremist viewpoint by most of the people, and it is largely against the law.
Okay, so Elizabeth Van Lew, or the Van Lews in general, have taken this particular interest in Mary Jane, who, as you noted, was baptized at St. John's Church in 1846, as opposed to the African American Baptist Church. So that shows some level of interest on their part in this child. We don't really know why or what, except that we can follow. Soon, the Van Lews, or Elizabeth, sends her to up north to New Jersey to study, possibly to prepare her to go to Liberia, because Elizabeth, we know, had gotten involved in the American Colonization Society, which, as one of the things that people could do.
Right. So one of the options available to you if you're a generally anti-slavery feeling person in the 1840s and 50s, one is manumission and sending people out of Virginia. The other is the Colonization Society, which broadly speaking is seeking to basically relocate every free African American to a predetermined spot in Africa. It's kind of this grand social experiment. And so the Van Lew ladies are involved in that, and this Mary Jane Richards, as we see, is singled out for some kind of like very special attention, sent north, educated with the intention of being a missionary, and she goes to Liberia. We're talking about as a teenage girl. Mm-hmm. This is your new life. Cross the Atlantic Ocean to a continent you've never seen and make a new life there. So this young woman is there for like 5 years as a missionary, 4 years. The indications are, maybe not surprisingly, that she's not having a great time and she's not getting on very well. So in 1859, the Van Lews arrange for Mary Jane Richards to return, which is a very complicated thing to do because an African American cannot legally come to Virginia in 1859. It is against the law. So once, as far as the law is concerned in Virginia, once Mary Jane Richards left that state, she can never come back.
Do we know for sure that she had been freed? Or we just don't
Essentially,
know?
As far as the law is concerned, once she left and was gone for a certain amount of time, like that's it. So,
okay.
Right.
So she comes back. They bring her back. She's very unhappy. Elizabeth Van Lew brings her back to Richmond. And where does her story pick up from Elizabeth Van Lew after that?
Right. So now we're edging into summer of 1860. So for looking back, we have got the dark cloud of the Civil War just about to burst. You have a wealthy white woman with anti-slavery and extremist for her time and place political sentiments, and you have Mary Jane Richards, an African-American young woman in her early 20s who has illegally entered the state of Virginia to return to the Van Lew house. She illegally comes back. She's arrested for being here, which is a crime according to Virginia law.
In Richmond, she's
arrested in Richmond, yes. There's a watchman who picks her up. One of the newspapers says she's arrested for perambulating the streets, claiming to be a free woman of color. It's legal for a free African American to come to Virginia and visit for a few days. So initially, a young woman's arrested in Richmond, gives the name Mary Jane Henley, and the newspaper says Mary Jane Henley is arrested for coming from Liberia and says she's only here on a visit, which would be legal. Now that's not going to hold up for very long. So before a couple of weeks have gone by, the name has changed and Mary Jane Henley has claimed to be Mary Jones.
Okay.
And then when the Van Lew ladies returned to town, that same Mary Jane Henley and Mary Jones is revealed by them to be Mary Jane Richards and said to be enslaved. Because if she's free, she cannot be released from jail.
So does she at that point return to the Van Loo house, and she is either enslaved in name or free in name, or we don't really know her status as far as the relationship between she and Van Loo, because
Right.
they may have had this secret understanding. We don't know.
Exactly. So she's there. As far as anybody in the bubble of that house is concerned, yes, you're free. You've educated. You've left the country. You've come back. But what does that mean when you live in Virginia and the Civil War has just started and it's just become the Confederate capital?
Right. And you go outside.
And you go outside.
Right.
That person, under any circumstances, couldn't walk the streets of Richmond without a piece of paper written by one of those two Van Loo ladies who says, this is where I'm going. You have to have a pass.
Right.
From a white person to just walk the streets at that time. So it's quote unquote freedom in a purely legal sense, but it certainly isn't something that would probably feel like freedom as a lived experience. And when
Sure.
Mary Richards said in an 1865 speech, the Civil War came, and she said she despaired and almost prayed to die. Think about having just crossed the Atlantic Ocean, seen another continent, come back, wondering what your life is going to be. And what it ends up being is you now live in the Confederate capital in a war that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Maybe this place is going to be the Confederacy forever. That's what's facing her. And that's that next bit of record. We see the marriage record at St. John's. Someone named Mary, quote,
Yeah.
Mary's Wilson Bowser at St. John's Church. It says Mary and Wilson Bowser, who are servants to the Van Loos. So it's the name Mary. It doesn't have the Mary Janes, but someone named Mary at the Van Loo house at the time when all this is also going on. Mary's someone named Wilson Bowser. That was the day before Virginia voted to secede. So right in the midst of Fort Sumter, the start of the war, and Virginia changing its mind from voting no on secession to voting yes.
Right. Can we get back in the house? The war has started.
1861, the war's started. There's a mansion on Church Hill with two Unionist, abolitionist ladies living in it, with Mary Jane, who is in multiple levels of subterfuge with regard to slavery and freedom in Virginia. And then there's the circle of friends that are going to be meeting with them there, the Unionists of Richmond. Nobody in 1861, when the war started, is a Union spy. It seems kind of logical for them to sort of wait and see what's going to happen. Is this whole thing going to blow over before you risk your life and your fortune fighting the local government? What if it fizzles out in 6 months, right?
Right.
So in 1861, these folks are quietly commiserating and kind of sharing secretly their sentiments. By the time you get into 1862, the large battles have started to happen, and that means Richmond has started to fill with the dead and the wounded and prisoners.
Right.
So the first thing that the Unionists in Richmond do is be the only ones willing to care for and house Union prisoners. So the rich men that Elizabeth Van Loo knows offer up their tobacco warehouses to house these prisoners. Elizabeth Van Loo and Mary Jane Richards, according to her 1865 account, go to visit the prisoners. And in this case, you're giving them a book to read, a blanket, some water, just giving them care that they're not otherwise going to get. At the end of that's where it stands, because they've drawn an iron curtain around Virginia. You can't come and go to Washington, D.C., nor can information, or to Philadelphia, where her family is.
Okay.
So they basically had the curtain drawn around them, and they're locked in to the Confederacy. By then, they've figured out a route of, if somebody needs help, an enslaved person or a Union prisoner, by 1863, there is a way to get them north of Fredericksburg. So there are a series of friendly people that have now formed that relationship, and that's when they've graduated from helping prisoners comfort to helping prisoners get out.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody makes a round trip, that changes everything. In December of 63, at the end of the year, one of the prisoners who escaped reappears with a note from General Benjamin Butler and a secret code and invisible ink and an address to write to him. So it says, hey, how'd you like to be employed? And so suddenly there is a means of communication in and out. And that's when Elizabeth Van Loo and everybody associated with her officially becomes a spy, an agent.
Okay.
So that's when 64 rolls around and into 65, you have then actual military information getting collected and sent out. The references to then Elizabeth Van Lew are myriad because the head of military intelligence, Colonel George Sharp, there's correspondence back and forth. General Butler, famously General Grant, after the war said she sent the most valuable information that came from Richmond during the war.
So what do we know about what Mary Richards, or as she's sometimes known as?
So there was a Mary Bowser in 1861.
Right.
The next time we see this person potentially is in 1863. A replacement registration for Freedom Papers is issued to a woman named Mary Jane Henley.
Henley.
If you remember that name,
Yep.
that's the alias that Mary Jane Richards gave when she was arrested in 1860. So that name reappears. Mary Jane Henley now has that free pass to say she's not enslaved and can move about the city. That also means the name Mary Bowser has disappeared. I have never found it again after that.
So really the only link with Bowser is that marriage.
Is that marriage, yes. Other than that marriage record, there is no Mary Bowser.
Okay.
Elizabeth Van Lew's diary in 1864 specifically mentions, she says, every morning when I get up, I say, "What news, Mary?" And my caterer never fails. But she specifies a name and a job for a Mary in her house. She goes on to talk about, in that context, how African Americans all around the city, including this Mary, are some of her best sources of information.
Okay.
So we tend to assume that that's the same Mary. We don't know with 100% certainty, but how many Marys are in the house?
One that we know of.
Right. Well, we could really get into the weeds there because the census in 1860 at Elizabeth Van Lew's house has a Mary in the house, but it's a Mary Jones. But this could be the same person because Mary Jane Richards that we know has a list of pseudonyms already that we can document, and one of them is Mary Jones.
Okay.
Yeah, so there are 3 different names for possibly the same Mary in this house.
Okay, so so we know that she's in Richmond.
Yes.
She's still in the household.
Yes. And
she may be technically, or at least as her employee would be the caterer or some sort of, work in the house, in the kitchen or in the dining room or something. And
that she's collecting information for Elizabeth Van Lew. That's in her diary. So
where does the idea that she spied in the Confederate White House, Mary?
Right.
So that is something that's sort of
all over,
but not necessarily proven.
Right. So the first time the story of a Black woman working in Jefferson Davis's house exists, it postdates Elizabeth Van Lew's death. So just a couple of months before that, so far, the first is an unnamed. It just says, people, every once in a while, there's a story. Elizabeth Van Lew, the spy, and they kind of tell the story. But this one added that she placed an African-American woman in Jefferson Davis's house without naming her. And that's just there. 10 years later, Harper's Monthly went to investigate that story further, talked to the little niece who lived in the house during the war, who was aged about 6 to 10. And that young woman, now in her 50s, gave the name Mary Elizabeth Bowser and told this story of, quote, a African-American woman of unusual intelligence who worked in Jefferson Davis's, was at his dining chair, and et cetera, et cetera. So the stories kind of build from that. It was published in 1911.
Okay.
That was where it stood for about 100 years until someone not too long ago uncovered that Mary Jane Richards gave a speech in New York City in September of 1865 in which she claimed to have basically broken into Jefferson Davis's house once, brought some washing, broke into some drawers, looked at some papers, was let in by a clerk, and left. So as far as stories of Mary Bowser, quote, the woman we know as Mary Jane Richards, the woman who collects information for the Union during the war. That woman said in 1865 that she went to Jefferson Davis's house once, and 50 years later, Elizabeth Van Loo's niece told the larger tale of her working in that house.
And by that point, her name is Mary Elizabeth Bowser.
Right.
So it does
has never been her name. Yeah.
That had never been her name. So who knows?
There is an Elizabeth in that house.
And that leads
in the kitchen.
Elizabeth Draper.
Elizabeth Draper is a teenage girl who works in Elizabeth Van Loo's kitchen during the war. So it's not impossible that 50 years later, somebody might have conglomerated those two names, I suppose.
Right. And so if Elizabeth Draper is in the house in 1864, what do we know about her?
Elizabeth Draper was described as an assistant to the cook in Elizabeth Van Loo's house. So somebody who is in this place, and obviously you would assume has to know what's going on. This is a house that potentially has Union soldiers coming and going. It has a woman running an espionage network in it. So it's clear that the staff in the house, and it's so difficult for us because we don't know, especially because of all this Mary stuff, whether sometimes people are enslaved or they are free paid servants.
Right.
But
they know. They have to know because of...
They have to know what's going on because they're part of it. They're in on the story. They're in as much danger as everybody else.
And more than one time, Confederate, I don't know who they are, detectives.
They're called detectives. The detective service will send somebody like in the guise of a Union soldier to say, please help us. And
to try to confirm that they are
right
conducting espionage and that they are traitors.
So yeah, there's at least one instance where Confederate detectives pretending to be Union soldiers are turned away because they've not kind of gone through the established channels. There is also an instance where actual Union soldiers are turned away because they unexpectedly escape Libby Prison in the middle of the night in 1864. And when they show up at the house, because the Van Loos are gone and the service staff of the house weren't told to expect them, they turn them away. So they are being careful. They're trying to cover their tracks.
People know.
Yeah.
Okay. Getting back to where we were with Elizabeth Draper. So we've actually got, this is fascinating, in this house.
Yes.
We've got Elizabeth Van Loo. We've got Mary Jane Richards.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got now Elizabeth Draper.
Right.
In the same house at the same time.
Right. And in the grand drama that is the wide world of the Civil War going on right outside your porch for Elizabeth Van Loo, who is receiving information, packaging it, and sending it to General Grant. Mary out there gathering information. And in the middle of this, someone a little younger, Elizabeth Draper, gets pregnant at the end of 1863. So there's some family drama in the house at this time. So this young girl, unmarried obviously, is pregnant. The father of the child is Eccles Cuthbert, an Irish-born Confederate soldier working at the Chimborazo Hospital. He's a clerk at the Chimborazo Hospital. So under circumstances that we do not know and probably never will, these two got together and made a baby. And in the longer story, that child born in July of 1864 is Maggie Draper, then Maggie Mitchell, then Maggie Walker. Little Maggie will be the first generation of African Americans in Virginia who never directly experienced slavery. It exists for only the first 1 year of her life. And then she has some access that almost no one in Richmond had as an African American before that, which is public education. The Confederates left on April 2nd, 1865, and at that moment it was illegal to teach an African American how to read and write. And on April 3rd, that changed, and almost immediately aid societies came, private organizations, and the Freedmen's Bureau came. So as a child coming into the world, she's going to have an opportunity that, Mary Richards is unusual, that she got sent away to school. She had to get sent away to go to school because she couldn't go to school in Virginia. She was a teacher. On April 3rd, it became legal to teach African Americans to read and write in Richmond. Within 2 weeks, Mary Richards has come back to Richmond, having left, and she is a teacher for the New England Freedmen's Aid Society.
Okay, when did she leave? I'm sorry.
She said that she left the previous fall. So at some point in that last year of the war.
That she had left Richmond.
She had left.
Oh, okay.
At some point toward the end of the war, Mary Richards left the city.
Okay.
For Union territory, but came back immediately.
Immediately, and we know she teaches in Richmond.
We have her at Ebenezer Baptist Church
Okay.
in Jackson Ward. It's just a number of weeks that she's teaching, because by the end of the summer, she is in Boston at the Aid Society headquarters, and by September, she's in New York City giving speeches. So it's a brief teaching career in Richmond.
In Richmond, it's brief, but does she not then?
She goes to St. Mary's, Georgia.
Right. And does she end her life there? Is that where she lives for the end of her life? Do we know?
No. So 1867, she's teaching at a Freedmen's Bureau school in rural Georgia.
Right.
That's when she bumps into Harriet Beecher Stowe. And we have another document of her life and her story, because Harriet Beecher Stowe writes about meeting her.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And her telling the story of being a spy and all that. Then she said to the superintendent of the schools, I'm going to marry someone named Garvin and close the school. The next month, she did leave and close the school, but she had married someone named Denman. So her last sign-off is she's Mrs. John L. Denman. She leaves the school, and the next place, and so far the last place I found her, is back in New York, 1870. 3 years later, she wrote a letter to Elizabeth Van Lew as M.J. Denman, thanking her for her invitation. Miss Van Lew invited Mary Richards Denman to come back to Richmond, and she declined and gave her reasons for doing so. She's going to make her own way in the world. She's a 30-year-old woman, and it's time to be on her own. Meanwhile, little Maggie Mitchell, who will eventually be Maggie Walker, is growing up there. And that is also somebody who never, ever leaves Richmond. Maggie Walker comes from the Van Lew house.
And she grows up in that house, you're saying?
Within, I think by 1868, 3 years after the war, her mother, Elizabeth Draper, has married William Mitchell, an African-American man who is said to be working in that house as well. And they move to College Alley, which is right by College Street. If you know, in Richmond now where the First African Baptist Church is, she would have grown up basically across the street from there.
Okay.
In the midst of like the MCV sort of complex.
Okay.
So that's where she grew up, having begun her life and spent the first couple of years of her life in the Van Lew house. She then has a mother and a stepfather building a life in Reconstruction Richmond. Her biological father continues to live in downtown Richmond as well as a newspaper reporter.
So Maggie Walker, at the tail end.
First African-American woman to start a bank, and then she served as its president. So starting in the Van Lew house, going to College Alley, she grows up as a product of Richmond's public education system and is inspired to be a teacher. That's the career that she chose. She lost her stepfather when she was 11. He was killed in Richmond, so she's being raised by her mother as a single African-American mother in post-war Richmond. It's right about that same time, as Maggie Walker is becoming about 12, that Reconstruction ends. And that means the Union soldiers who have been here since the end of the Civil War, protecting civil rights and voting rights, they leave. Mm-hmm. So just as Maggie Walker is becoming a young adult woman, going into high school and beyond, Jim Crow is beginning.
Right.
The former Confederates are coming into power. They're passing new laws, new regulations, disenfranchisement, poll tax, all that stuff. As a teacher, as a young woman, she teaches. The law in Virginia, as in many places, is that teachers can't be married. So when she got married to Armstead Walker, she had to stop teaching, give up a job she loved.
Wow, okay.
That is a history-making moment because nothing about Maggie Walker's personality tells us she's going to just accept things have to be a certain way. She's going to find a sideways way to still do it anyway. So what she did was join the fraternal organization, the Independent Order of St. Luke, It was a club, social club, that also paid death benefits to members, paid for funerals when they died. She encouraged more of a juvenile young people's involvement, so got more kids involved. By the time she gets it to its peak, it's got 100,000 members in more than 20 states. It ends up having more money than just the organization needs. So she, as the 20th century begins, so right about the time from where we started, when Elizabeth Van Lew is passing away, Maggie Walker is about 40 years old, with more money than her organization needs, and the Jim Crow era in Virginia reaching its apex. So she's thinking, what can we do? It's 4 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court has upheld segregation. So the law isn't coming to help you. What are your options? Education and economics. So using that organization's money to feed into the whole community. Starting that St. Luke Penny Savings Bank means she's going to be able to allocate those funds for business loans, home loans, to build the African American community in Virginia. And, you know, voting with your dollars can be very effective as well.
So this St. Luke's...
The Independent Order of St. Luke was a fraternal organization.
Fraternal.
So think about like your Elks Lodge and your Rotary
Okay.
Club and your Freemasons.
So,
they have secret handshakes and ceremonies and things like that.
oh yeah.
They also serve as an insurance company, which is something that a lot of African American communities kind of coalesced and did in the post-Civil War era.
So, but where was that?
It was a national organization.
National,
So
okay.
she started in a local chapter, worked her way up, and just had that aptitude, ended up being the Right Worthy Grand Secretary, has a great title. She's sort of in charge of the money of the organization.
Of the national organization.
Yeah.
And where was that headquartered? Was that in, I mean, did she do that from
It
Richmond?
began in Baltimore. But eventually, she really is the national face of the organization. So it's got a headquarters building on St. James Street in Jackson Ward now. She undertakes, you know, the architect building this kind of large structure. Is still there, just got renovated into apartments. So there's a St. Luke building headquarters, and there's a St. Luke Penny Savings Bank building.
Wow. Okay. So that she does that from here in Richmond, and then
Yes.
that bank she can work within. So is that mostly Jackson Ward? Is that the African American community?
Yes, you'll see it go from a traditional African American community to a fully legally segregated by the turn of the 20th century as well. So you'll see that kind of redlining and restrictions on who can live and work where. By the time of Maggie Walker's era, you have Jackson Ward being referred to as Black Wall Street, as you had in Tulsa, as you had in Charlotte. One of my favorites is the Harlem of the South.
Mm-hmm.
The time of the Harlem Renaissance, when amazing poets and writers and musicians were coming out. We had something similar going on here, this great kind of cultural renaissance. So that is her era, the kind of 1910s, roaring 20s.
We started our conversation with the prologue from Elizabeth Varon's book describing the grand house on Grace Street, the Van Lew mansion. In that same prologue, Elizabeth Van Lew dies, and it's 1900. What happened to Mary Bowser? Do we know what happened to her, like where or how or when she even died?
Presently, we do not. So presently, we have lost track of Mary Jane Richards,
right.
AKA Mary Bowser.
The
last we know is Greenwich Village, 1870. She's bought a sewing machine and making payments on it, and she's planning to go to the teacher's school there.
Okay, and
that's. I hope we'll find out more. More stuff continues to come up as we look, but right now we don't know her ultimate fate. We don't know where her grave is, how long she lived. She's right now off in the mists of history.
Okay.
Fingers crossed that we'll find some more.
And we do know Maggie Walker, and she now has her own monument here in Richmond.
And it's very close to where her department store was.
Oh,
she's famous for a bank. She's the first Black woman to start a bank, but she was a bank, the head of a national fraternal organization with 100,000 members, department store, newspaper publisher. Kept pretty busy.
She gets a statue.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So that's right on Broad Street. So to get back to the house, what happened to the house?
So yes, after Elizabeth Van Lew passed away, the house became the Virginia Club, sort of gentleman's establishment where people drink brandy and smoke cigars and talk about important politics and stuff like that.
Okay.
So a place for gentlemen to get together. It was that for a few years, and then it was purchased by a doctor who ended up operating a tuberculosis hospital, sanatorium there. And I found a little article in the paper that said the doctor was hauled into court for operating an illegal tuberculosis sanatorium.
What year was that? 1910? 20?
That was 1910, 11.
Okay.
Because that was at the same time the city was on the lookout for a place to build a new elementary school, which would require a fairly large footprint to build a big school. As you know, when you look at the Bellevue School, it takes up a lot of space. As it so happens, this house was for sale. Not many other people wanted it. So it's not, once in a while in the realm of internet legend, you'll see it maybe implied that Richmond bulldozed Elizabeth Van Loo's house because she was so hated by Richmonders. And it's not really the case. It's just city needed a school when a tuberculosis hospital was closing down. So that's why the house was removed. And the Bellevue School, which is there now. So the view that you see at that corner, sort of around 1911, is when that was happening. And coincidentally, that is the same year that the Mary Bowser story was published in Harper's Monthly. The story of Mary Elizabeth Bowser, the Black Spy in the Confederate White House. So just as this sort of relic of the idealized antebellum age represented by Elizabeth Van Loo, just as that's physically disappearing, the legend of Mary Bowser is appearing. And that's right about the time that Maggie Walker is at the height of her influence as an adult woman who now, at that point, she's running the bank, the department store, the newspaper, and the St. Luke organization. So the old world is disappearing and kind of the new world is chugging ahead.
So we know that Elizabeth Van Loo is buried at Shockoe Hill Cemetery.
Yes.
Okay, so what do you know about her funeral?
So she had a funeral. If you look at it in the newspaper,
Yep.
Again, there's so much kind of, she is also this sort of figure of legend, right?
Right.
The legend would be that like she was sort of broke and alone living in this big empty mansion and that nobody came to her funeral. But you would see the newspaper listed friends and family coming from Boston, coming from Philadelphia, people from Richmond. So as we talked about earlier, the idea that she was sort of a pariah in Richmond, I think probably has something to do with she's dying right about at the time when the Lost Cause mythology. She died 10 years after the big Robert E. Lee statue is built. So this is a time when a lot of the press, the books, the publications are building up that sort of Lost Cause Confederacy myth. And when you do that, Elizabeth Van Loo is going to be kind of the villain of the myth. So the idea of crazy bet, if you've ever heard that she was a crazy person.
Crazy bet, yeah.
That is never, there's no primary source that suggests that, and that mainly comes after she's died as well, when she can no longer sort of defend herself. I've read many newspaper accounts of her later in life and after her death, and it depends on which newspaper you read.
Right.
Some of them are like, hey, here's that hero from the Union who helped keep the Union together, and the different newspaper with a different editor says there's that nasty woman who was a traitor to the South. So yeah, the myth depends on who's telling it to you.
Right, as history depends on who writes it. So,
right.
So what about Maggie Walker? So she dies in 1934. Is she buried at Evergreen?
Evergreen, yes.
Okay.
So Evergreen Cemetery, Maggie Walker, there's a family plot. So she's there. Her stepfather's there, her husband, her kids.
Where's her mother, Elizabeth Draper? Is she there?
She's there as well, yep. She lived in the house with her. So we talk about her on the tour of Maggie Walker's house. When Maggie Walker moved in 1905, her mother's there. She's in the family photos. She lived until the early 1920s. When I go to that house, we talk about, there's a set of photographs of 4 generations of the family there, of Elizabeth Draper, her daughter, Maggie Walker, the kids and the grandkids. Her granddaughter is a doctor in Chicago. And you see from the Van Loo house, Elizabeth Draper being there, somebody who at some point was enslaved and knew that direct experience, that lived experience was in that house, to Maggie Walker being the first generation who didn't experience it, saw Reconstruction, saw Jim Crow, passed that memory on to kids into grandkids. And though their kids are still around, and we sometimes see them at the house. So it also lets you know how not long ago some of this stuff was.
Absolutely. Wow. We could talk all day.
We could.
That is super interesting. Nathan Hall from the National Park Service, thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope that you will see the virtual bus tour that we broadcast yesterday.
Black Union spy in Richmond, who was Mary Jane Richards.
That's right. So if you want to know more in depth about Mary Jane Richards, although we did kind of go into her today, but I think the bus tour is maybe a little bit more about some of the places that she might be identified with here in the city of Richmond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Again, Sarah White, St. John's Church Foundation. Thank you.